Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Real-time ray tracing is finally here, and today we're exploring how the effect looks and performs in the first game to support it fully, Battlefield 5. In this video, we've not only benchmarked the 3 Nvidia GeForce RTX cards across all the ray tracing presets in the game, but we've also got some great comparisons for you to show exactly the difference between RTX on and RTX off in the real world. We've already touched on Battlefield 5's regular performance across a range of GPUs in a video earlier this week, and we found that it runs pretty well on ultra settings with a range of graphics cards. Nvidia's new RTX cards do particularly well, with something like the RTX 2070 being able to play at above 120 FPS at 1080p or well above 80 FPS at 1440p. And naturally, the RTX 2080 Ti is an absolute beast at both these resolutions with frame rates above 140 FPS. But we now have ray tracing in Battlefield 5, and since the announcement of RTX features back in August, the big question has been how the game would perform once this stressful effect is enabled. Nvidia has been very careful not to show any official performance figures for the effect running on even their flagship RTX 2080 Ti, but we've seen plenty of reports from those that have tried an early demo version suggesting we're looking at a 1080p 60 FPS experience at best. So how is ray tracing integrated into Battlefield 5? Well, it's all pretty straightforward. All you need to do is download the Windows 10 October 2018 update, version 1809, to support Microsoft's DirectX ray tracing technology, or DXR. This update was famously delayed for more than 5 weeks due to bugs, but Microsoft resumed the rollout a little over 24 hours ago, so you can now force download it using Microsoft's Windows 10 update tool if it isn't already in Windows Update for you. You also need to update Battlefield 5 to the latest version through a hefty 16GB patch, and you'll need the latest GeForce 416.94 drivers from Nvidia. After all that, you simply load the game, enable DirectX 12, then enable DirectX ray tracing reflections. From there, you'll have access to 4 preset options for DXR, the standard ultra, high, medium, and low settings in the game. If you just use the presets rather than custom settings, the DXR mode corresponding to your preset will be selected. You'll also see here that DICE isn't using GameWorks to integrate ray tracing, instead sticking to a basic cross-vendor DirectX ray tracing implementation. RTX, which is Nvidia's ray tracing technology platform, sits below DXR in the stack and is the tech that essentially translates DirectX ray tracing requests from the game into the stuff the GPU can actually work with. So how does DXR actually look in Battlefield 5? Well, here's a direct comparison of all 4 presets, and the first thing you should notice is there is a large visual difference between ultra and low, but there's not much of a difference between ultra, high, and medium. In fact, there is basically no difference between those settings for DXR reflections, and it's not just in this scene. I tested several other sections of the game and couldn't spot any difference between the highest 3 settings. This leads me to conclude that there are only really 2 DXR modes in the game. Ultra, which applies the full complement of ray tracing reflections in the game, and a cut down low mode for better performance. Both the low and ultra modes apply reflections to surfaces like water, puddles, and shiny objects, but it's only the ultra mode that also applies these reflections to more matte surfaces like mud and your gun. You'll spot in this scene, for example, that the ultra mode reflects the fiery vehicle wreck off the muddy surface in the front, as well as on the barrel of your weapon at some distance away. Switch down to low, and the reflections disappear on your gun and from the mud, leaving just reflections from the water's surface. From what we can tell, this is the main difference between the 2 modes. The quality of reflections in terms of resolution, accuracy, and draw distance is unaffected between the presets, so you get the same sort of experience looking at those shiny surfaces whether you're playing on ultra or low. Switching it down a notch only affects the amount of materials and surfaces that RTX reflections apply to. Ultra, in my opinion, gives a far better and more realistic presentation and really shows off the quality of ray tracing, while low, it's still pretty good, but it's not quite at the same level. One of the main questions is, how does ray tracing compare to the game's standard reflection mode, screen space reflections? Well, undoubtedly, DXR provides a more realistic presentation with far greater reflection accuracy and resolution, and of course the ability to reflect objects that aren't necessarily in your field of view. Screen space reflections are only able to reflect objects present on the screen, so things outside the field of view are crudely cut off in an unnatural way depending on the angle of reflection. You'll notice in the DXR off footage that any anything passing over the reflected area, like the falling leaf particles or other people, causes artifacting in the reflected area and looks pretty ugly. But before you wonder, this is the same issue that was present in Battlefield 1. So it's not like DICE has specifically downgraded reflections in Battlefield 5 only to upgrade them again with ray tracing. Naturally, these issues aren't present with ray tracing. You get nice, accurate reflections in real time. But there are some issues with DXR as well. In this scene with a large puddle, DXR seems to be reflecting God ray type lighting effects that don't actually exist in the non-reflected world. One of these effects also is bizarrely cut off, which you can see here. Then in the footage showing reflections on the surface of your gun, reflection quality is quite low with almost a video encoded blockiness to the effect even at 4K. Reflection resolution of water doesn't seem to be impacted nearly as much by this low resolution effect. In fact, I'd say the quality of those reflections is very good. It's also worth pointing out that ray traced reflections is the only ray traced effect in Battlefield 5. Every other aspect of how the game is rendered is done through traditional means. So shadows and ambient occlusion, for example, are the standard game effects. This means that if you're not in an area with reflective surfaces, you basically aren't getting any benefit from DXR. So let's talk performance, and here's where it all falls apart for ray tracing because performance is absolutely horrendous even if you have Nvidia's flagship RTX 2080 Ti. And just wait until I show you the results from the RTX 2070 because it's, well, I guess you'll see in a moment. For this testing, we used all three of Nvidia's RTX cards running on a Core i7 8700K test rig, and we tested at both 1080p and 1440p. For reasons that will become quickly apparent, we didn't bother testing at 4K. All other settings were set to Ultra, and we only tested with the Ultra and Low DXR settings as well as DXR off. There was no performance difference between Ultra, High, and Medium for DXR reflections. Our test run was during an intensive part of the single player campaign with lots of reflective areas. We also did some spot tests in multiplayer, but it's hard to get consistent, accurate results only testing in the multiplayer part of the game. In any case, we didn't see any significant performance differences between single player and multiplayer in similar environments. So here's the results with the RTX 2080 Ti. And boy oh boy, it's not looking pretty. At 1080p, the game comfortably runs at 150 FPS with DXR disabled, but as soon as you crank the DXR mode up to Ultra, performance absolutely tanks, dropping to below 50 FPS. In other words, performance is immediately cut to 1/3 of its previous level. Switching down to the low mode does improve things somewhat, although we're still facing half the frame rate we once had. And even with an RTX 2080 Ti, it's only at low DXR settings at 1080p that we're looking at average frame rates above 60 FPS. Then at 1440p, it's nightmare territory. Using the Ultra DXR mode, performance is roughly 1/4 of what it was with DXR off, while the frame rate was more than halved using the low mode. Neither setting can deliver 60 FPS with an RTX 2080 Ti. The game is smooth and very enjoyable with DXR off at 1440p with this flagship GPU, but with DXR on, it's not a pretty situation. Then looking at the RTX 2080, we're only just creeping above 60 FPS on average at 1080p with the low DXR mode. Again, performance is cut down to 1/3 of what it was when using the Ultra mode, which in this case delivers around 40 FPS, which isn't acceptable for a first-person shooter like this, even in single player. And at 1440p, how does a 47 FPS average sound using the low DXR mode compared to more than 100 FPS with DXR disabled? And with the RTX 2070, performance is absolutely laughable, if I'm honest. The Ultra mode delivers 30 FPS at 1080p, down from 110 FPS with DXR disabled. And with the low mode, we're unable to hit a 60 FPS average. The game is completely unplayable at 1440p as well, with DXR on an RTX 2070 in our opinion. It's interesting to note across these tests that we are being RT core limited here. The higher the resolution, the higher the performance hit using the Ultra DXR mode, to the point where playing at 4K is more than 4 times faster with DXR off. This also plays out when we spot checked power consumption. The cards were running at consistently lower power with DXR on because the regular CUDA cores are being underutilized at such a low frame rate. Again though, the degree to which performance is reduced does depend on how many reflective surfaces surfaces are in the environment. Wet, muddy areas are the most heavily impacted. Playing in the city area of Rotterdam in multiplayer mostly had shiny reflective surfaces, so the performance hit wasn't as bad as in our benchmark runs, but we're still facing less than half the frame rate with the Ultra mode. And then snowy areas seem the least affected with relatively good performance, namely above 80 FPS at 1080p with DXR on and a 2080 Ti involved, if you can count that as good. But no matter the environment, if there are no appropriately reflective surfaces, performance will be much better, though it still won't really come close to reaching the level of playing with DXR disabled. At the same time, if there are no reflective surfaces, visual quality is largely identical to playing with DXR disabled, so you really want to camp near water and shiny surfaces to get that sweet ray tracing goodness. So when it comes down to it, DirectX ray tracing in RTX has basically played out exactly as expected in the public launch of the technology in Battlefield 5. It was looking like performance would be terrible, and well, it is terrible. Just judging based on the demo footage compared to performance you can get today, and it doesn't look like there have been many significant steps towards getting ray tracing running at a higher frame rate. It's just extremely computationally intensive. Now, real-time ray tracing is a significant graphical achievement. It's something that has previously been impossible with single GPUs and will likely be the future of the graphics industry. But right now, there is basically no reason to enable ray tracing in Battlefield 5 because the performance hit is so severe, it impacts the experience massively. We're in a situation where the RTX 2080 Ti is only somewhat playable with DXR enabled at 1080p, while 1440p is borderline and 4K is out of the question. Then with the RTX 2080, you might be able to scrape by with the low mode at 1080p, and in our opinion, the RTX 2070 is not suitable for ray tracing at all. And that's just looking at DXR performance on its own. The game runs at excellent frame rates with these cards with DXR disabled. We're talking well above 100 FPS on all three cards at 1080p. 1440p is also very playable at high frame rates on even the RTX 2070, and you can even enjoy 4K gameplay, particularly on the 2080 Ti. I just don't see why any gamer would choose to cut their frame rate at least in half, sometimes up to a quarter, to get ray tracing in a game where frame rate has a significant impact on competitiveness and the overall experience. You want to be running this game at 130 FPS with the still visually excellent ultra settings, not 40 FPS with slightly better reflections. On top of that, the quality improvement from DXR reflections is nice, but you'll be hard-pressed to spot the difference in fast-paced motion. Screen space reflections, while not perfect if you stare at a puddle for hours, do a decent job of approximating reflections at a respectable performance cost. And when you're more focused on running around and shooting enemies, I'd say it's almost impossible to tell the difference between SSR and DXR reflections. And it goes beyond just the raw performance and comparisons in Battlefield 5. Real-time ray tracing was meant to be the key selling point to the GeForce RTX cards. Nvidia was basically using this technology as a way to justify the higher price of these cards compared to their GTX predecessors. It was meant to be a game-changing feature, I guess, something that would revolutionize your gaming experience with crazy levels of visual quality. But the reality is, at least with Battlefield 5, the quality improvement doesn't come anywhere close to justifying the insane performance drop you'll experience with DXR enabled. RTX in this game simply isn't a reason to buy the RTX cards. It doesn't justify the price premium you're paying for RTX features, because honestly, I can't see any gamer playing with DXR enabled for more than a few minutes. When you buy an RTX 2080 Ti, you want to be playing the game at more than 120 FPS at 1440p with ultra settings. You don't want to cut that down to below 60 FPS so reflections can be slightly more accurate. You spent $1,200 on the card after all, you should be getting well over 60 FPS at 4K, let alone 1080p. For real-time ray tracing to become the future of graphics technology, we need more computing power. Specifically, we need more RT cores in Nvidia's GPU architecture because the 68 cores provided with the RTX 2080 Ti, allowing for 10 gigabytes per second, well, it isn't cutting it. This may be a stepping stone to getting ray tracing supported in games and to show the technology off to the world, but consumers really shouldn't be paying a premium right now to run what essentially amounts to a tech demo on their PCs. And honestly, Nvidia should have been far clearer about what to expect from ray tracing when they announced their new GPUs. It's all well and good to announce real-time ray tracing as a major new feature, but buyers are going to be disappointed when they purchase a $1,200 product for real-time ray tracing only to find out using that feature results in awful performance. If ray tracing was presented as more of a look into the future rather than a feature ready for prime time in today's games, it'd be much easier to swallow what is being dished up in this initial release. The RTX 2070 deserves a special mention here because this card can barely be classed as ray tracing compatible, delivering performance barely over 30 FPS at 1080p with DXR reflection set to low. It's clear that a mere 36 RT cores and 6 gigaраys per second of ray tracing performance doesn't cut it for actual real-time ray tracing. I'd be bitterly disappointed if I bought an RTX 2070 for ray tracing only to be left with that sort of performance on the lowest settings in Battlefield 5. And I'm expecting a similar story with other games that are set to use ray tracing in the future, such as Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Metro Exodus. Everything we've seen from demos of DXR in those games suggests we're facing a similar performance penalty to Battlefield 5 for a similar small increase in quality. We'll test those games with ray tracing as soon as we can, but I wouldn't be holding out for anything better in future titles. So I guess that brings us to the end of this initial Battlefield 5 and DirectX ray tracing evaluation. We'll have a full video breaking down the rest of Battlefield 5's quality options and providing you with some optimal settings in the next few days, so subscribe and stay tuned for that. Consider supporting us on Patreon to get access to our exclusive Discord chat and monthly live streams. It's been a lot of work to get this one done in a very short period of time, so I hope you all appreciate it, and I'll catch you in the next one.